Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Suburban Crisis, White America and the War on Drugs, by Matthew Lassiter, narrated by Tom Beyer. Publisher's note: in this audio edition, you will hear references to tables and figures present in the print and e-book formats of the book. Introduction. Philip was 15 when he bought the heroin that sent 3 black male pushers to prison in the first mandatory minimum sentences handed down under Illinois' punitive new narcotics law in 1951. Jean, a 20-year-old showgirl, was confined in a narcotics hospital when Congress and the national media reconfigured her testimony of seeking out dealers in urban slums into a parable of the inevitable progression from marijuana experimentation to heroin addiction and the tragic fate of prostitution across the color line, the tropes that justified the first federal mandatory minimum penalties for sale and possession of both drugs in the Boggs Act of 1951. Patricia was 16 and had recovered in a suburban Los Angeles rehabilitation facility when the media saga of her spiral from marijuana to heroin as a victim of Mexican pushers helped propel California's escalating war on narcotics during the early to mid-1950s. Linda was an 18-year-old from a wealthy Connecticut suburb who frequented the hippie drug scene in the East Village when her murder played a key role in redefining the 1967 Summer of Love as an urban crisis of runaway daughters and hopeless narcotics addiction. A few years later, an anonymous 19-year-old female from a good family in San Diego, hooked on heroin after smoking pot, became President Richard Nixon's rationale for why the 1970 federal drug legislation needed to toughen punishment for traffickers but reduce marijuana possession to a misdemeanor as leverage to coerce victims into rehabilitation. Leanne was a 20-year-old former cocaine dealer in a New York City addiction center when she became the most prominent casualty of the crack epidemic to testify to Congress for the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, which imposed harsh and inflexible trafficking penalties aimed at inner-city black areas that corrupted entire metropolitan regions. All of these felony lawbreakers were white, transformed into addict victims and the poster children for each stage of the escalation of the American war on drugs through a consensus process that united elected officials, mainstream media, and the discretionary criminal justice system as well. The millions of white youth who consciously broke the drug laws generally viewed themselves as autonomous actors and as victims primarily of the carceral state and criminal prohibition itself, not as the innocent prey of so-called pushers and the apocryphal marijuana gateway syndrome. Marianne was 23 and admitted to smuggling heroin across the Texas-Mexico border when she demanded legalization of all drugs and condemned forcible medical institutionalization, refusing to follow the predetermined racial and gender script of her victim status in testimony, as the U.S. Senate toughened mandatory minimum penalties in the Narcotic Control Act of 1956. Joe was 17 and adamantly defended the freedom to smoke pot, undeterred by multiple arrests, when the Los Angeles Times labeled him a dope addict in a 1959 series about Mexican pushers defiling white youth that inspired yet another legislative crusade against marijuana and heroin in California. Paula and Eve were young bohemians in the East Village when they told the U.S. Senate in 1966 that a proposed LSD ban would make criminals of otherwise law-abiding people, and that their generation would never comply. Frank was 19 when he received a 20-year prison sentence for marijuana possession in 1969, and his college classmates forecast a revolution if the law enforcement crackdown on the youth counterculture continued. Robert was a high school senior from suburban Virginia in 1970 when he informed a dismayed congressional committee that marijuana and LSD should be legalized immediately as a right of personal freedom, that criminal law could never suppress the teenage market, and that the youth generation violated drug laws as part of a broader political rebellion against the hypocrisy and meaninglessness of middle-class society. Nicole was a college-bound student from an affluent white suburb speaking on national television when she defended the right of teenagers to break underage drinking laws and engage in harmless recreational use of marijuana and even cocaine, part of the widespread youth rejection of zero-tolerance politics during the 1980s. State institutions and American political culture have consistently waged the war on drugs through the framework of Suburban Crisis and positioned white middle-class youth as impossible criminals who must be protected from the illegal drug markets and then shielded from the consequences of their criminalized activities. As a racialized political and cultural category, the white middle-class suburban victim has been as foundational to America's long war on drugs and crime as the non-white threats of the foreign trafficker, urban gangster/pusher, and predatory ghetto addict. In drug control politics and in discretionary law enforcement operations, these racial binaries have separated the entangled metropolitan and global drug markets into distinct sectors of innocent and otherwise law-abiding victims to be arrested and diverted into rehabilitation, and the real criminal villains who should be targeted through saturation policing and incarcerated for a long time. The modern war on drugs has operated through the reciprocal decriminalization of whiteness and criminalization of blackness and foreignness, grounded in selectively deployed law enforcement and in the discursive framing of idealized suburban spaces and pathologized urban slums and border towns. This racial state-building project escalated through a politics of consensus in modern American history, with bipartisan and overwhelming legislative majorities for every landmark federal policy shift, and usually at the state level as well. Liberal and conservative regimes alike have mobilized to subdue narcotics traffickers in urban and international markets, defend middle-class suburban communities from external threats, and figure out how to keep white youth out of prison when they continuously refuse to comply with laws and policies designed for their protection and social control. The racial and spatial logics of the war on drugs reflect not only the bipartisan mandate for urban crime suppression and border interdiction, but also the balancing act required to resolve the impossible public policy of criminalizing the social practices of tens of millions of white middle-class Americans. The imperatives of suburban political culture transformed cyclical epidemics of illegal drug use by white middle-class youth into crucial foundations of the American war on drugs and the expansion of the carceral state at three key stages between the 1950s and the 1980s. Each of these developments involved the grassroots mobilization of white suburban networks and interest groups, stories largely untold in the existing scholarship about the war on drugs, and the immediate responsiveness of government officials to their political demands and racial anxieties. Each escalation responded to increasing rates of marijuana smoking among white youth by portraying this criminalized leisure practice as a nationwide emergency, magnified by broader forces perceived to be causing once utopian suburbs to descend into dystopian nightmares. During the 1950s, as mass automobile-based suburbanization intensified mainstream fears about an epidemic of juvenile delinquency among affluent teenagers, the news media hyped a marijuana-to-heroin gateway narrative, and middle-class women's groups demanded severe penalties to prevent urban and foreign pushers from corrupting white youth who were supposed to be safe in their racially segregated neighborhoods. The U.S. Congress unanimously enacted a series of mandatory minimum drug control laws that explicitly targeted non-white villains while recycling the racist tropes of white female addict prostitute victims popularized by Commissioner Harry J. Anslinger of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, FBN. In California, the epicenter of the 1950s war on narcotics, lawmakers, under pressure from a sustained grassroots suburban crusade, repeatedly toughened mandatory minimum penalties while carving out discretionary loopholes for good youth from good families. This futile effort to eradicate the middle-class market by arresting and diverting a subset of lawbreakers into rehabilitation exacerbated racial and economic inequalities without stemming the steady increase in circulation of both marijuana and illicit pharmaceuticals in LA's white suburbs. The second key stage of the white suburban front in the war on drugs began in the mid-1960s when the generation gap revolt on college campuses embraced marijuana and LSD in the context of the anti-Vietnam War movement and the emergence of a hippie counterculture in urban bohemian enclaves. By decade's end, this psychedelic drug revolution had become a widespread phenomenon in the urban and suburban high schools of coastal states and major metropolitan areas, where around half of older teenagers had violated the felony marijuana laws, alongside 1/5 of high school seniors nationwide. The generation gap framework placed these high school and college lawbreakers, many of whom righteously advocated marijuana and LSD legalization, into a political rather than a criminal category, even as law enforcement arrested an unprecedented number of white middle-class youth through a strategy of deterring their recreational drug use while diverting them from prosecution to avoid the stigma of a permanent criminal record. The total failure of this approach led to a bipartisan consensus for drug law reform at the federal and state levels, most notably through the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act of 1970, a collaboration between Democratic leaders and the Nixon administration that Congress passed with near unanimity. In addition to escalating penalties for professional traffickers, justified through sordid tales of suburban teenagers taking the marijuana gateway to heroin addiction, the federal law reduced possession and casual sale of all illegal drugs to a misdemeanor in order to use probation to force violators into rehab. This coercive public health policy led to an extraordinary surge in arrests of white marijuana smokers in the early to mid-1970s, which in turn produced vibrant grassroots political movements for legalization or decriminalization in order to protect these otherwise law-abiding youth from any encounter with the carceral state. The marijuana decriminalization campaign conspicuously insisted that law enforcement should focus only on the real criminals in urban heroin markets. The third, and by far the most racially inequitable phase in the modern drug war, began not with crack cocaine in the mid-1980s, but 8 years earlier, when parent power groups started forming in upper-middle-class white suburbs to sound the alarm that marijuana smoking and illegal drinking were skyrocketing among younger teenagers and even middle schoolers. This parents' movement portrayed itself as a nonpartisan awakening to save suburban children from the permissive effects of marijuana decriminalization and an alleged mass outbreak of amotivational syndrome, the unscientific and racialized diagnosis that smoking pot turned college-bound white youth into unproductive slackers, emulating ghetto pathologies. The Parent Power campaign placed the 12 to 14-year-old stoner at the center of its moral crusade, which resonated during an era of economic recession and pervasive concern about white middle-class family breakdown, with mothers working and latchkey children unsupervised. The suburban network coalesced into the National Federation of Parents for Drug-Free Youth, NFP, and powerfully shaped the embrace of zero-tolerance policies by the Carter and Reagan administrations, leading to the federal government's prioritization of the white middle-class gateway drugs of marijuana, as well as underage drinking, even as the urban crack cocaine crisis emerged. In 1986, as the Democratic leaders in Congress engineered passage of the Anti-Drug Abuse Act with near unanimity, the national media and the political system continually highlighted white suburban victims of the new marijuana-to-cocaine gateway scourge, in direct juxtaposition with the black inner-city gangsters who sold the poison. As with the invading pusher, runaway daughter, and gateway-to-heroin tropes of previous decades, the zero-tolerance, just say no campaign of the late 1970s and 1980s played a key role in institutionalizing two interlinked but spatially distinct approaches in the drug war: coercive public health campaigns in white middle-class suburbs and militarized interdiction in non-white urban centers, at the border, and in the international arena. The Suburban Crisis utilizes a comparative case study approach to analyze the dynamic interplay among the local, state, and national levels, as well as the real and symbolic interrelationship between cities and suburbs in metropolitan regions. The book integrates the areas of politics, culture, and public policy formation by analyzing the circulation of discourses and meanings that constructed the racialized drug crisis alongside social history investigations of how illegal drug markets, law enforcement, criminalized youth practices, and grassroots activism actually played out on the ground. The goal is to bring together the methods of the new political history, linking grassroots political culture and metropolitan political economy to state formation at all levels, a capacious approach to urban history, moving beyond the city-suburb binary for a comprehensive assessment of metropolitan regions, and the insights of cultural studies, tracing how discourse, symbolism, meaning, and imagery circulate and shape popular attitudes, political ideologies, and policy outcomes. The chapters that explore the workings of suburban drug markets and criminal law enforcement include case studies of multiple metropolitan regions and emphasize the ways in which these local processes flowed upward to reshape law, politics, and policy in the state capitals and in the legislative and executive branches of the national government. The chapters that revolve around the major federal escalations of drug control legislation between the 1950s and the 1980s connect the action in Washington to the influence of suburban political formations and interest groups, the circulation of crisis discourses about white middle-class victims in the mass media, and not least, the criminalized social practices and resistance politics of youth themselves. This comparative methodology documents the racially and economically divergent outcomes for youth who broke the same laws but lived in different parts of metropolitan regions, and also reveals that the escalation and selective de-escalation of the war on drugs was a bottom-up and not simply a top-down political process. The centrality of Southern California to this history and the problem of defining American suburbia with precision are interrelated. California's recurring role as the pace-setter for national drug war trends rested on a spatial foundation in terms of how law and political culture intersected with the built environment. The sprawling and racially segregated suburbs of metropolitan Los Angeles were close enough to the border for white middle-class youth to drive their cars to Mexico to acquire illegal drugs, and even closer to the unincorporated Mexican-American area of East L.A. that grassroots coalitions and law enforcement blamed for causing the problem. Los Angeles County alone produced more than one-third of all drug arrests nationwide through the mid-1960s, as both the LAPD and the county sheriff's department policed diverse metropolitan landscapes with many white suburban-style neighborhoods inside the city limits and significant non-white enclaves in the outlying areas. California enacted its first mandatory minimum drug law in 1951, before the U.S. Congress passed similar legislation. The state's commitment to tough enforcement and coercive rehabilitation provided the template for subsequent federal drug war crackdowns and also galvanized the nation's most vibrant marijuana legalization movement. Metropolitan Los Angeles also serves as a microcosm for how the suburbs functioned as real and imagined places of normative middle-class whiteness in American political culture, obscuring the considerable heterogeneity of the many diverse communities located outside major U.S. cities. This book's equation of the racialized category of suburban with the demographic and sociological category of white middle-class America involves both a commitment to exploring the politics of drug and crime control in affluent and segregated suburban areas, and an emphasis on how political culture and public policy conflated and constructed these imagined communities through discourses of crisis and epidemics, pushers and victims, utopia and dystopia, white innocence and its racial and spatial opposites. The Drug War Consensus and the Carceral State. The Suburban Crisis reassesses the political history of modern America by analyzing the escalation of the war on drugs from the 1950s onward as a consensus project of racial and carceral state building shaped by the intertwined policies of punitive law enforcement and coercive public health. The consensus framework illuminates the broadly shared commitment to protecting the white middle-class victim and incapacitating the non-white urban and foreign predator through drug control laws and crime control strategies that merged punitive policies of incarceration and involuntary rehabilitation into a comprehensive, discretionary, and inequitable system for the social control of teenagers and young adults. Conventional wisdom, and much of the scholarship, portrays law enforcement and public health as competing, if not opposite, approaches. The punitive incarceration crackdown, spearheaded by conservative Republicans, versus the compassionate rehabilitation agenda championed by liberal Democrats. This book demonstrates that the bipartisan architects of the war on drugs always envisioned the operation of both policies in tandem as coercive mechanisms to control youth subcultures through the broader legal umbrella of criminalization. Liberal and conservative policymakers generally agreed that some combination of criminal sanctions and compulsory rehabilitation should regulate the illicit drug market. Criminalization guaranteed that police, prosecutors, and delinquency agencies would largely manage access to the allegedly benevolent alternative of rehabilitation through a discretionary arrest and divert process that utilized the threat of incarceration to coerce select illegal drug users, invariably labeled addicts or abusers. The criminalization consensus marginalized the genuine civil liberties alternative that the state should not arrest citizens for victimless crimes and that prohibition itself generated criminogenic outcomes. Almost no elected officials or influential policymakers endorsed the position of millions of Americans and a subset of medical experts that government should not harass citizens for drug use at all. The bipartisan politics of drug war consensus is clearly evident in the overwhelming and often unanimous congressional support for every major escalation. Landmarks include the federal laws targeting black and Mexican pushers in 1951 and 1956, the misdemeanor reforms designed for white marijuana violators in the 1970 omnibus package, and the arms race of harsher penalties for inner-city crack markets in 1986 and 1988. The common thread is race, not partisanship. The shared ideological commitment was to the project of political whiteness, defined by scholar Daniel Hosang as a hegemonic framework in American political culture where no large gulf existed between so-called racial liberalism and racial conservatism. While elected officials often sought partisan advantage by maneuvering to claim credit for tough policies, this dynamic should not mask the underlying racial consensus that shaped drug control policymaking. The priorities of federal lawmakers at each stage aligned with the dominant racial tropes circulating in the news media, the political demands of white middle-class constituents, and parallel developments in the state legislatures and the nation's vast criminal justice and juvenile control apparatus. This constellation of forces repeatedly transformed the latest drug crisis into a white middle-class epidemic that always spread outward from urban centers to invade previously placid suburbs and turn otherwise law-abiding teenagers and young adults into addict victims or impossible criminals. Policing agencies and public health authorities then collaborated on strategies to arrest and redirect these innocent casualties or misguided youth into the rehabilitative arm of the carceral state. While affluent white drug criminals rarely experienced incarceration, a consequence disproportionately imposed on lower-income and non-white counterparts, These divergent outcomes resulted not only from the inherently discretionary mechanisms of the criminal legal system, but also...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?